My mother called me on a Sunday afternoon and said 5 words I have never forgotten. 5 words, delivered in the same even, matter-of-fact tone she used to remind me to pick up milk on my way home. She said, "Don't come home for Christmas." I asked why. She said, "Your sister doesn't want you here." And then she hung up. No explanation, no argument, just the click of the call ending, and the silence of a December afternoon pressing in from every direction. Those words just hit you somewhere real. You're why who this story is for. Please subscribe right now. Give this video a like and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. I genuinely read every single one. And I promise you, this story is worth staying for all the way to the end. My name is Emma Callister, and I was 26 years old when my mother made that phone call. 26 years old, living 40 minutes from the house I grew up in, working as a graphic designer at a small creative studio called Harbor and Company, paying my own rent, buying my own groceries, living the kind of quiet, functional adult life that nobody makes movies about because there is nothing dramatic enough on the surface to justify the camera. I was not loud. I was not the kind of person who took up a lot of space in a room. I had spent most of my life being the daughter who handled things, who figured things out without being asked, who showed up when it was needed, who didn't cause scenes or start conflicts or demand to be centered in every conversation. I thought that was a virtue. It took me a long time to understand that in my particular family, it had simply made me easier to overlook. Our house in Denton, Ohio, was the kind of house that looked warm from the outside. Brick front, white shutters, a porch with a wicker chair my mother had painted blue one summer and never repainted even after it started peeling. There were photos on the walls inside, school pictures, holiday portraits, the kind of visual evidence that says, this is a family, this is a home, these people belong to each other. And we did belong to each other. I want to be careful about that because the easiest version of this story would be to paint my parents as people who simply did not love me. That is not what happened. What happened is more complicated and in some ways harder to articulate because it involves the specific pain of being loved in a way that is not equal and spending years telling yourself that the difference is in your head and then arriving at a moment when you can no longer pretend that it is. My father, Dennis Callister, was a man who had built his identity entirely around keeping things peaceful. He managed a mid-size hardware distribution company for 22 years, was respected at work, was pleasant at dinner parties, coached my brother's little league team for 3 summers when I was a kid even though he knew almost nothing about baseball. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had confused the absence of conflict with the presence of love, and who had learned somewhere early in his marriage that the easiest way to maintain peace in the house was to defer to my mother on everything that happened inside it. The consequence of that strategy, which he had never once, to my knowledge, examined, was that whatever my mother believed became the operating reality of our home. And whatever my mother chose not to see simply did not exist. My mother, Linda Callister, was the engine of our family in every practical sense. She organized the holidays, remembered every birthday, coordinated school pickups and dentist appointments, and the complex social calendars of 4 people with a competence that I genuinely respected. She was not cruel in obvious ways. She did not call me names or tell me I was worthless or behave in the way that people imagine when they picture a bad mother. What she did was quieter and more persistent. She had a favorite. She had always had a favorite. And the favorite was not me. Sophia was 28, 2 years older than me, and she had been the sun around which our family orbited for as long as I could remember. Not because she was particularly exceptional. She was smart. She was social. She had the kind of easy charm that plays well at family gatherings. But because my mother had decided early and completely that Sophia was the one who mattered most. I don't know the root of it. I have thought about it enough times that I've stopped trying to find a clean answer. Some mothers simply connect more naturally with one child than another. And when that mother lacks the self-awareness to manage that connection fairly, the other child spends her entire childhood quietly absorbing the imbalance without having any language for it. That was me. I was the child who absorbed it. Year after year, Christmas after Christmas, report card after report card. Sophia's achievements celebrated, mine acknowledged. Sophia's moods accommodated, mine managed. Sophia's needs centered, mine assumed to be covered because I never made them visible enough to require attention. I had made peace with it. Or at least I had constructed a version of peace that involved not looking at it too directly. I had moved out at 22, built my own small life, found real joy in my work. Graphic design was not just a job to me. It was the one place where I had always been entirely myself, where the thing I was best at was also the thing I loved most. I had a good eye, a strong instinct for what made a visual story land, and a work ethic that my studio director, a warm, precise woman named Claire, had described more than once as the kind you can't teach. I was not rich. I was not famous. But I was genuinely, quietly good at something, and I had found it myself, and that mattered more to me than I had words for at the time. The weeks leading up to that phone call had not been easy. Sophia and I had reached a kind of friction point that had been building for longer than either of us had acknowledged. She had come to visit me in October, one of her occasional, unpredictable appearances in my life that usually left me feeling vaguely unsettled. And we had gotten into an argument about something that started small and expanded in the way that arguments do when they are not really about the thing they appear to be about. It was about a birthday dinner for our mother. I had planned it, reserved the restaurant, confirmed the reservation, and mentioned it to Sophia 2 weeks in advance. Sophia had decided, without telling me, to plan something else for the same weekend. When I pointed out the conflict, she said I should have checked with her first. I said I had given her 2 weeks' notice. She said that wasn't the same as checking. I said it was actually exactly the same. She did not like that. Sophia had never responded well to being disagreed with directly, particularly by me, and the argument ended with her leaving my apartment and a silence settling between us that I thought, naively, would resolve itself in the normal way that sibling arguments resolve. It did not resolve. What happened instead is that Sophia called my mother, and my mother listened to Sophia's version of the story, and my mother decided, as she had decided every time in our shared history when Sophia and I came into conflict, that Sophia was right, and I was the problem. I know this not because anyone told me, but because I know exactly how my family operated. And because the phone call that came 6 weeks later on that Sunday afternoon in December was the logical conclusion of a pattern I had been watching my entire life without fully naming it until it was aimed directly at me, with nowhere left to hide. After my mother hung up, I sat on my apartment floor for a while. I wasn't crying yet. I was in the particular suspended state that comes right after something hits you that is both a complete shock and somehow, on a deeper level, not a surprise at all. It is the feeling of something you have half known for years finally arriving in its full, undeniable form. I sat there, And I thought about every Christmas I could remember. The way Sophia's gifts were always the ones my parents got most excited about giving. The way the dinner conversation always curved back towards Sophia's job, Sophia's apartment, Sophia's plans. The way I had learned, gradually and without noticing, to make myself smaller at the table so there was more room for everything else. I had been shrinking myself for years and calling it maturity, and now the house had simply made official what had always been true in practice. There was not quite enough room for both of us, and I was the one who would be removed to make space. I called my father that evening. He answered after 3 rings, his voice carrying the slightly cautious quality it always had when he knew a difficult conversation was coming. I asked him if he knew about what my mother had said. He said he did. I asked him what he thought about it. He said it was a difficult situation, that things between Sophia and me had gotten complicated, that maybe some time and space would help everyone settle down. I said, "Dad, she told me not to come home for Christmas. Do you understand what that means?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Emma, your mother thinks it's for the best right now." I waited for something else, something that sounded like a father. It did not come. He said he hoped I was doing okay. He said we'd talk more later. He said goodbye. We did not talk more later, not for a very long time. I did not go home for Christmas. I spent it in my apartment with a small string of lights I'd put up around my window because I had refused to let the day be completely joyless, a grocery store rotisserie chicken, and a movie I watched twice because I fell asleep the first time and needed the noise. My friend Priya, who had known me since college and understood more about my family than most people did, called me in the afternoon and stayed on the phone for 2 hours. She did not tell me it would be okay in the hollow, reflexive way people do when they don't know what else to say. She just stayed on the line. That was the best gift I received that year, and I have never forgotten it. January arrived, and I went back to work, and I did not call my parents, and they did not call me. February came, and I got a text from my mother on my birthday, a single line. "Hope your day is good. Emma." Not mom, not love. Just Linda Callister, sending 11 words to the daughter she had told not to come home, as if that absolved her of the weight of the 6 weeks of silence that had preceded it. I stared at that text for a long time. I did not reply. That was the first time in my entire life I had not replied to my mother on my birthday. It felt significant in the quiet, irreversible way that small acts feel when they are the first of their kind. In March, I drove to the house, not to reconcile. I was not ready for that, and I was not sure what reconciliation would even look like without an acknowledgement of what had happened. I went because I had left some things there over the years. Books, a box of childhood drawings, a quilt my grandmother had made that I had always meant to take with me, and never had. I called ahead, and my mother answered and said I could come by on Saturday morning. She said it as if I was a neighbor asking to borrow something. I said I would be there at 10. The house looked the same from the outside. The wicker chair was still on the porch, still peeling. I knocked. I did not use my key, which told me something about how much had changed, and my mother opened the door and let me in. She was pleasant in the way she is when she does not want to discuss something. She offered me coffee. I said no thank you. I went to the spare room where my things had been stored, and I packed the box of drawings and took the quilt down from the top shelf and carried everything to my car in 2 trips. My mother stood in the kitchen doorway and watched me. My father was home, but stayed in the living room. I could see the back of his head over the couch. He did not come out. I did not go in. I picked up the last box, and I stood in the front hallway for a moment, and I looked at my mother and said, "I need you to understand that what you did in December hurt me, not the conflict with Sophia. I could work through that. The way you handled it, what you said to me." My mother said, "Emma, this isn't the time." I said, "It never is," and I left. I sat in my car, in the driveway, for 2 minutes, long enough to make sure I was steady enough to drive. Then I pulled out and went home, and I unpacked the quilt and put it on my bed, and I looked at it for a while, this thing my grandmother had made that had always belonged to me even when everything else felt uncertain, and something in me settled. Not healed, settled. There is a difference. Healing is a long road. Settling is finding your footing at the start of it. The months that followed were the hardest I had navigated as an adult. Not because my life fell apart. It did not. It held. But there is a specific, persistent ache that comes from being estranged from your family of origin, even when that estrangement is the healthiest thing available to you. It lives in the small moments, not the large ones. It lives in the Sunday afternoons when the city is quiet and you are 26 years old and you have no particular reason to feel lonely, and you feel it anyway. It lives in the moment when something good happens at work and your first instinct is to call your mother, and then you remember why you aren't calling your mother, and the good thing dims slightly at the edges. I felt all of that. I let myself feel it. I did not perform being fine because I was not always fine, and pretending otherwise would have cost me things I could not afford to lose. There is something that nobody prepares you for when you step away from a family that has been the central emotional architecture of your life. Even a family that has hurt you, even a family where the love was unevenly distributed and the dynamics were quietly damaging. What nobody prepares you for is how loud the silence gets before it gets manageable. I had thought that putting distance between myself and the situation would feel like relief. And there was relief. I won't pretend otherwise. But the relief and the grief arrived together the way complicated things do. And some days the grief was louder. I would walk past a bakery on a Sunday morning that smelled like the cinnamon rolls my mother used to make on Christmas Eve, and the smell would catch me completely off guard, and I would have to stand on the sidewalk for a moment and breathe through it. That is what nobody talks about when they talk about cutting family off. The ambushes. The ordinary Tuesday afternoon that suddenly becomes a reminder of everything you are not allowed to miss, but miss anyway. I did not let those moments stop me, but I honored them. I let myself feel them without deciding they meant I had made the wrong choice, because grief for a lost relationship does not mean you should have stayed in it. It means you are human and you loved people, and they did not handle that love carefully enough. And that is a loss worth grieving even when the distance is the right decision. I had to learn to hold both things at once, the rightness of where I was going and the realness of what I was leaving behind. Some days I held them better than others. All days I kept moving. What I did instead was work. I poured everything I had into Harbor and Company, and Claire noticed, and the work got better because I was no longer spending any energy managing the emotional static of my family situation. I had thought for years that I had been compartmentalizing my family stress effectively, keeping it separate from my creative output, not letting it bleed through. What I discovered in its absence was how much it had been bleeding through all along. Without it, my work opened up. I started taking more risks with design concepts, bolder typography choices, more unconventional color systems. layouts that broke the expected grid in ways that somehow made the whole piece more coherent. Claire gave me a senior designer title in April, 8 months after the Christmas call. She said I had always had the talent, and now I was letting it run at full speed. I did not tell her why. I just said thank you and meant it completely. Priya was a constant through all of it. She came over on weekends, and we cooked elaborate meals we found in cookbooks we'd thrifted, which sounds wholesome but was also genuinely the activity that kept me most human during those months. There is something deeply stabilizing about feeding yourself, about standing at a stove with a friend and chopping things and talking about everything and nothing while something good happens in the pan. I know that sounds small. I am telling you it was not small. The small things were what kept me from becoming someone hollowed out by grief, and I am not embarrassed to say so. I heard about my family in fragments, the way you hear about people you have deliberately stepped back from, through mutual acquaintances, through the occasional text from a cousin who was careful not to take sides. Sophia had gotten engaged in the spring to a man named Brett Harmon, who worked in commercial real estate development and co-owned a company with a partner called Harmon and Reed Properties. My parents were, by all accounts, thrilled. There was an engagement party I was not invited to. My cousin Maya texted me afterward and said she'd been thinking of me. I thanked her and did not ask for details. I was practicing deliberately and with effort the discipline of not pulling at threads that would only unravel me. The second year was different from the first. Quieter, but differently quiet, not the pressing silence of fresh pain, but the more open silence of someone who has started to get used to their own company and discovered it is not as sparse as they feared. I moved to a bigger apartment. The first space I had ever had that felt genuinely designed for the person I actually was rather than the person I was trying to afford to be. I painted the second bedroom a deep, muted green and used it as a studio, and working in that room on evenings and weekends produced some of the best personal projects I had ever made. I started posting work online, carefully curated, consistent, building a visual identity that was entirely mine, and the response was slow at first, and then steady, and then something that began to look, if I squinted at it, right like a small creative following. Claire left Harbor and Company in the fall of my second year to start her own venture, and she asked me to come with her. The new studio was called Meridian Creative, and it was exactly the kind of place I would have designed if someone had asked me to design. The ideal working environment for myself, small team, high standards, clients who trusted the creative process enough to let it actually work. I said yes before she finished the offer. We built Meridian from 4 people and a rented loft into something genuinely respected in our city's design community within 18 months. I was named creative director at 28, which meant I was leading the vision on every major client project and building the internal design language of the studio from the ground up. I was not performing confidence by then. I had earned it slowly through 1,000 decisions made in rooms where no one was rooting for me except myself and the people I had chosen rather than inherited. It was during the 3rd year that I met Daniel Hurst. He was an architect at a firm 2 floors below Meridian in the same building, and we had been vaguely aware of each other in the way that people in adjacent creative fields tend to be: mutual respect from a distance, the occasional crossing of paths at building events, a nod in the elevator. He had a quality I had learned by then to identify and value. He was genuinely interested in what other people thought, not in a performed way, in the way that makes you feel when you are talking to someone, that what you are saying is actually landing somewhere and being considered rather than simply waited out. We had coffee for the first time in November, and it turned into 3 hours. And I drove home in the dark thinking about how long it had been since I had talked to someone new and felt completely like myself the entire time. Daniel was not the center of the story I was building. I want to be honest about that because it matters. He was a good man in the right place at the right time, and he made the third year considerably warmer than the second. And he was the first person I had trusted enough in a very long time to be fully unedited with. But the story, the spine of it, the part that was actually mine, was already in motion long before he walked into it. He stepped into a life I had already built, not one I was waiting to begin. That distinction, I have come to believe, is everything. The call that changed everything in a new direction came on a Tuesday morning in late October, 3.5 years after that December phone call from my mother. I was at my desk reviewing typography options for a brand identity project when our studio manager, Jess, knocked on my door and said there was a potential client on the line, a commercial real estate development company looking for a full rebrand. Full rebrand meant strategy, identity, digital presence, the whole package. It was the kind of project Meridian had been building toward. I told Jess to send over their intake form, and I'd be in touch to schedule a discovery call. She said they'd already sent it. I opened my email. The company was called Harmon and Reed Properties. I read the name twice. I set down my coffee. I read it a third time, just to be sure. Then I opened the intake form and scanned it, and there, listed under key stakeholders and primary contact for the project, was a name I recognized, Brett Harmon, Sophia's husband, my brother-in-law, technically, from a wedding I had not been invited to. I sat with this for a long time, not because I was panicking, I was not panicking, but because the moment required thought. And I was someone who had learned in the years since that Sunday afternoon phone call to think carefully before acting on anything with emotional weight attached to it. I considered declining the project. I had every right to. Meridian had enough work that turning down a single client, even a significant one, was not going to break anything. But I sat with that option, and I looked at it from every angle, and what I kept coming back to was this. I was a professional. I was good at my work. I had built something real, something earned, something that did not need to apologize for itself to anyone, including my own sister's husband. Declining the project because of personal history would mean letting that history limit me. I had spent 3 years refusing to let it do that. I was not about to start now. I scheduled the discovery call. Brett Harmon was on the call with his business partner, a man named James Reed, and they were both straightforward and serious about the project. They had grown the company significantly in the past 2 years, were positioning for a move into a higher tier market, and needed a brand identity that matched the ambition of where they were going rather than where they had been. It was a genuinely interesting creative challenge. By the end of the call, I was professionally engaged despite myself, and I told them Meridian would put together a proposal within the week. We got the project, and 6 weeks in, when we were ready to present the initial identity concepts, Brett Harmon called to ask if his wife could sit in on the presentation. She was, he said, closely involved in the company's vision and had strong opinions about the creative direction. I said, of course. I scheduled the meeting for a Thursday morning, and then I put my phone down and breathed very slowly and deliberately for about 30 seconds, which is my version of handling a situation calmly. I did not tell my team about the family connection. It was not their weight to carry. I prepared for that presentation the way I prepared for every significant presentation, methodically, thoroughly, with the kind of attention to detail that means you walk into a room already knowing you belong there. I wore the charcoal blazer I had bought myself when I became creative director. I brought the work. The work was good. I knew the work was good. That knowing was the most important thing I could bring into that room, and it had taken 3 years and a considerable amount of quiet suffering to build it. Sophia was already in the conference room when I walked in. She was sitting beside Brett, a coffee in front of her, dressed in the kind of effortful casual that takes more time than formal wear. She saw me in the doorway. I watched her face run through approximately 4 different expressions in about 2 seconds: recognition, disbelief, calculation, and then something I had never seen on Sophia's face before in my entire life. She looked uncertain. My sister, who had moved through the world with the particular confidence of someone who had always had their parents' full wind at their back, she looked for just a moment like she did not know what to do. I walked in. I greeted Brett and James. I looked at Sophia and said, "Hi, Sophia." My voice was even, not cold, just professional. The voice of someone who has been doing this long enough to know that the room belongs to the work, not to the history. She said, "Emma, I didn't know." I said, "Should we get started?" Not unkindly, just decisively. She nodded. We got started. I presented for 40 minutes. The identity system we had built for Harmon and Reed was genuinely one of the strongest concepts Meridian had produced, a clean, confident visual language that positioned them exactly where they needed to be positioned, with enough flexibility in the system to grow with the company over the next decade. Brett and James asked sharp questions, and I answered them fully, and the room had the particular energy of a presentation that is landing the way it is supposed to land. Sophia said very little. She made one small comment about a color choice, which was a reasonable creative note, and I acknowledged it and explained the strategic reasoning behind it, and she nodded and did not push further. By the end, Brett said he wanted to move forward. We shook hands across the table. As people were gathering their things, Sophia caught me at the door. She said my name. I turned around. She looked like she was working hard to find the right words and not entirely succeeding. She said, "You've built something really impressive here." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "Thank you," a beat. Then I said, "I worked hard for it." It was not said with venom. It was said plainly as a fact, in the way that you state things when you no longer need the other person to understand their full weight, when you have said the true thing simply because it is true, and you are no longer performing it for an audience. She said she knew. She said she hoped, and she paused here. And for a moment, I thought she was going to say something real, something that cracked the surface. She said she hoped we could catch up sometime. I said maybe. I meant it as a genuine maybe, not a dismissal. And I left the room and went back to my desk and sat down and did not think about it for the rest of the day, because thinking about it would have cost me energy I needed for the work. And the work was what I was there for. Daniel proposed in the spring. In our apartment, the green studio apartment that I had made fully mine, with a ring he had chosen carefully and with the quiet certainty of a man who does not do things impulsively and does not say things he does not mean. He said he had been watching me build my life for 2 years, and he wanted to be part of it, not to take it over, not to rescue it, to be part of it. I said yes in approximately half a second, which for someone who tends to think carefully about everything was its own kind of statement. We planned the wedding for 14 months out. A small venue, an old converted textile mill on the edge of the city that a friend had recommended, with exposed brick and tall windows and light that came in at a particular angle in the late afternoon that made everything feel like it was worth commemorating. 70 guests, a dinner reception, flowers that Daniel and I had chosen together on a Saturday morning at the flower market, arguing gently over dahlias versus ranunculus until we compromised on both. I planned it the way I did everything, thoughtfully, specifically, in a way that reflected who I actually was rather than who anyone else expected me to be. The question of my family was one I carried for several months before I made a decision. I had maintained minimal contact with my parents in the years since everything had happened, holiday texts, occasional calls that were careful and surface level, the kind of contact that says we have not completely severed this, but we have not repaired it either. I had seen Sophia exactly twice since the boardroom presentation, both times briefly, both times with the particular civility of people who have too much history to be enemies and too little resolution to be friends. We were in a kind of holding pattern, all of us waiting for something I had not yet decided to offer. I decided to invite them, not because everything was resolved, not because I had forgiven everyone fully, and the wounds were healed, and the past had been rewritten. I decided to invite them because I am not the kind of person who builds her happiness on the exclusion of others, even others who have hurt her. I decided to invite them because this was my day, mine and Daniel's, and I refused to let my family's failings shrink what it was allowed to be. And I decided, if I am completely honest, because I had worked for 3 years to build a life that spoke for itself, and I was not afraid of them seeing it anymore. I was ready to stand in it, fully, and let it be witnessed, even by the people who had once told me there was no room for me at their table. I called my mother 2 months before the wedding. It was the longest real conversation we had had in nearly 4 years. She cried. I did not, which surprised me a little. I had expected it to be harder to hold myself steady through her crying, but I had done enough of my own processing by then that I could hold space for her emotion without being swept into it. I told her she and my father were invited. I told her Sophia and Brett were invited. I told her the date and the details. I told her I was not asking for a reconciliation speech or a grand gesture or anything that had to be performed for my benefit. I was simply extending an invitation to my wedding, and what they did with it was their business. She said they would be there. She said she was proud of me. I thanked her. I said I would see them in 2 months. I ended the call and sat for a while in my green studio and looked at the work pinned to the wall and thought about how far that room was from the apartment floor where I had sat holding a phone after a 5-word sentence had rearranged my world. I want to pause here for a moment because I think this part deserves more than a summary. The morning of my wedding was the first morning in 4 years that I woke up without any version of the low-level anxiety I had been carrying about my family. Not because everything was resolved. It wasn't. Not because I had stopped caring about the years of hurt. I hadn't. But because I had made my peace with the fact that I could not control what my family understood about me. I could only control what I built and who I became. And on that morning, I looked at the person in the mirror, in the dress I had chosen, in the apartment I had made, about to marry the man I had chosen. And I understood fully and without qualification that I had built something that belonged entirely to me. That feeling was better than any apology I could have been offered. It was the thing I had been working toward without knowing it had a name. The morning of my wedding was everything a wedding morning should be, and nothing like I had imagined when I was younger, which is to say it was better, specific, and imperfect, and genuinely mine. Priya was my maid of honor, and she arrived at 7 in the morning with coffee and pastries and the energy of someone who has been waiting for this day almost as long as you have. My college friend Taryn and Daniel's sister were there too, and the suite was full of the particular warmth of people who are actually happy to be exactly where they are. I got ready in that warmth, and I felt steady in a way that had nothing to do with calm nerves and everything to do with the fact that I had arrived at this day as a whole person, not a person who had survived something and barely held together, but someone who had taken the breaking and done something with it. My parents arrived before the ceremony. I saw them from across the venue lobby. My father in a dark suit, my mother in a blue dress that I recognized as one she'd bought for Sophia's engagement party and never worn. They looked older than I expected, or maybe I had just been measuring them against the frozen version of them that lives in memory when you aren't seeing someone regularly. My father saw me first. He walked toward me, and he did something I had not seen my father do in my entire adult life. He held out his arms. I looked at him for a second, and then I stepped into the hug. Not because everything was okay, but because it was my wedding day, and he was my father, and love, even complicated love, is still love. He said against my hair, "You look beautiful, Emma." I said I knew. He laughed. It was the first genuine laugh between us in 4 years, and it sounded strange and familiar at the same time, like a song you haven't heard in years that your body still knows the words to. My mother held my hands and did not quite manage to say everything she wanted to say, which was fine. I did not need her to say it. I needed to see her trying. She was trying. That was enough for the day. Sophia came with Brett, and she was gracious in a way that cost her something. I could see it costing her, which told me it was real rather than performed. She said I was stunning. I thanked her. We did not have the full conversation that day. That was not what the day was for. But she hugged me, and it was not the careful surface-level hug of two women who are maintaining appearances. It was a real one. Brief, but real. I let it be what it was. The ceremony was at 4 in the afternoon, and the light through those tall converted mill windows was exactly what I had hoped it would be, golden and slanted and full of the kind of depth that makes everything feel like it has been waiting to exist in exactly this moment. Daniel was at the end of the aisle looking at me with the expression of a man who cannot believe his luck. And I walked toward him without shaking, without hesitating, with the full and settled knowledge of every step that had brought me to this one. Priya was crying before I made it halfway down the aisle. Mr. Hargrove, Daniel's old professor and closest mentor, dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief. The people I loved, the people I had chosen, built, kept, were all around me. And my parents were there too. They sat in the 3rd row, my mother and father, side by side. They watched me walk down that aisle. They watched me stand at that altar. They watched me say the truest words I have ever said to another person in a room full of witnesses. And they were silent, not with discomfort or distance, but with the particular silence of people who are seeing something fully for the first time, who are sitting in the presence of a life and understanding, perhaps for the first time, how much of it was built without them. That silence was not a punishment. I had not planned it as one. It was simply what truth looks like when it no longer needs your permission to exist. It was what I had become, standing there in the light, in the life I had made, undeniable. The reception ran until midnight, and it was the best night of my life in the most honest, uncomplicated sense of that phrase. There was dancing and very good food and speeches that made people laugh, and then cry, and then laugh again. Priya's speech about the Christmas rotisserie chicken made the entire room howl, and I stood there listening and thought about that night in my apartment with the string lights and the movie I'd watched twice, and how that woman, sitting on the floor with her phone in her hand, and a silence where her family used to be, had somehow become the woman standing in this room, in this dress, in this life. The distance between those 2 points was not a straight line. It was 3 years of mornings where I made the choice to keep going, to keep building, to keep being exactly who I was even when nobody powerful enough was watching or approving. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Before the night ended, my mother found me in a quiet moment near the edge of the dance floor. She said she needed to say something. I waited. She said, I should have protected you. Not from Sophia, from my own blindness. I should have seen what I was doing, and I didn't. And by the time I understood it, I didn't know how to say so. She looked at me steadily, which I give her credit for. It is easier to say hard things to a floor or a wall. She said it to my face. I said, I know, Mom. I said, we have time. She nodded. She squeezed my hand. We did not fix 4 years of inequity on a dance floor in 30 seconds. But we found the beginning of something that was at least honest, which is always the only place worth starting from. I am 30 now. Meridian Creative has a team of 11. We've won 3 regional design awards and a national recognition I still have to remind myself is real when I walk past the framed certificate in the hallway. Daniel and I bought a house last spring. Not a starter house, but a real one, the kind you plan to be in for decades, with a yard that I am imperfectly and stubbornly learning to garden and a home office where I do my best work. My parents and I talk every few weeks. It is not the relationship we should have had when I was 26 and needed it most. It is the one we are building now on honest ground with the shared understanding that we are starting from a real place rather than a convenient fiction. That is more valuable to me than the easier version would have been. Sophia and I are finding our way towards something too. It is slow. It does not have a name yet. We have had 2 real conversations, not Harmon and Reed professional conversations, not holiday small talk, but actual ones where we said some true things and listened to each other say some more. She has her own complexity, her own history with our family, her own version of the story that I am slowly becoming curious about rather than simply defensive against. I do not know what we will be to each other. I know we are not done figuring it out. That is a different kind of hope than the one I started with. And it is the more durable kind. If I could go back and sit with the version of me who was on that apartment floor in December, I would not tell her it gets better quickly, because it doesn't. I would not tell her the people who hurt her will fully understand what they did, because some of them still don't. Not completely. What I would tell her is this. The life you are going to build on the other side of this is more completely yours than anything you were allowed to build while you were still trying to earn a place at their table. And there is a freedom in that, a terrifying, total, deeply clarifying freedom that is worth every cold night and every unanswered call and every moment you had to choose yourself when no one else was choosing you. You are going to become someone who does not need permission to exist. And the day they finally see you clearly, you will be standing in the middle of a life so full and so genuinely yours that their seeing you will feel like the smallest part of it. Hold on. Keep building. The light is coming, and it is going to be yours. The lesson this story carries, what happened to Emma, is something that more people recognize than are willing to admit out loud. The particular pain of being the child who did everything right and still couldn't earn an equal seat at the table. Her parents loved her. They just loved her less visibly, less consistently, less fully than they loved her sister. And when Sophia's preferences became more important than Emma's belonging, the family chose the comfortable story over the true one. The lesson is not that families are cruel. The lesson is that love without fairness is not the safe place it looks like from the outside. And recognizing that clearly enough to build a life beyond it is one of the bravest things a person can do. Emma's comeback was never about revenge. She did not engineer the boardroom moment. She simply became so good at her work, so clear in her identity, so rooted in who she was, that the irony took care of itself. The most powerful thing she did, the thing that made every other thing possible, was refusing to let her family's assessment of her become her own. She knew what she was worth before anyone else acknowledged it, and she built accordingly. How to apply this to your own life? If you grew up in a family where you felt like the less favored one, where your accomplishments were noted but not celebrated, where your needs were managed rather than centered, the first thing I want you to know is that it was not a reflection of your worth. It was a reflection of the limitations of the people who were supposed to see you clearly and did not. That is their failure, not yours. Naming it honestly is not disloyalty. It is the beginning of freedom. Build your evidence of yourself in the world, not to prove them wrong, but to prove yourself right. Find the work that makes you feel most fully like yourself and pour into it. Build friendships that are chosen, not inherited, and treat those friendships with the same loyalty and care you once spent trying to earn a place in a room where the seat was never really yours. When the hard conversations come, and they will come, speak from your most grounded self, not the wounded one, not the furious one, the one who knows what they have built and no longer needs permission to stand in it. And know this: you do not have to wait for your family to fully understand what they did before you are allowed to be happy. Happiness is not a reward for being understood. It is something you build day by day, choice by choice, in whatever direction your truest self points. The people who once couldn't make room for you will eventually find themselves standing in the presence of the life you built. And the most powerful thing you can do in that moment is simply let it be seen. Not for them. For every version of yourself that kept going when going was hard. That is the comeback worth having. That is the one no one can take from you.